I still remember the exact moment my world cracked open. It was on his deathbed, machines beeping like they were counting down, his hand weak in mine, and he whispered the words that ripped 19 years of my life apart. Maggie, there's another wife. There always was. 19 years. A whole lifetime of mornings waking up next to him, laughing over burnt toast, holding each other through storms built on a lie he carried every single day. He died hours later, leaving me with the truth he'd hidden since before our first kiss. And the other woman, she knew about me the whole time. She knew, and she stayed silent too. How does a heart survive that? How do you look back at every sweet memory and wonder which ones were real? I've replayed it all 1,000 times, searching for the moment I should have seen the shadows. But back then, God, back then, it felt like fate, like the universe finally got it right. It was April 1986 in Elmwood, Indiana. Small town, big skies, the kind of place where the river runs slow and everybody waves whether they know you or not. I was 30, running the public library like it was my own little kingdom, shelving books, shushing rowdy kids, recommending novels to folks who needed escape more than anything. Life was quiet, steady. I dated here and there, nothing stuck. Figured maybe I was built for stories, not the real thing. Then the door chimed one rainy Tuesday, and in walked Daniel Harlan. Dan, new history teacher at the high school, 34, carrying that quiet confidence some men just have. Sandy hair damp from the downpour, corduroy jacket spotted with rain, briefcase in one hand like it weighed nothing. He shook off the wet like a dog and headed straight for the history section. I watched him from behind the desk, couldn't help it. He flipped through a book on the Underground Railroad, brow creased, totally lost in it. Something about the way he handled those old pages, careful, respectful. It pulled me over. Need help finding something local? I asked, voice steadier than I felt. He looked up, hazel eyes meeting mine, and smiled, not flashy, just warm. Yeah, actually. Anything on the Wabash roots. Real stories, not just the textbook version. We ended up talking for 40 minutes. I pulled dusty volumes off high shelves, showed him faded maps yellowed at the edges. He listened like I was the expert, asking questions that made me feel smart, seen. You're good at this, he said, when I finished explaining a hidden crossing near the old mill. You make the past feel alive. By the time he checked out 3 books, he'd asked if I'd grab coffee sometime. To thank you for the crash course, he added, that smile again. And maybe hear more about Elmwood's secrets. I said yes before my brain caught up. That coffee at the diner turned into pie, then a walk along the swollen river as the rain let up. Water rushed under the bridge, air fresh with wet earth. Dan told me about leaving southern Illinois after his dad's farm went under, how history became his way of making sense of loss. I opened up about staying put after my dad died young, how books kept me company when the house felt too empty. No games, no rush, just easy conversation that flowed like we'd skipped the awkward part. When he walked me to my porch, streetlights buzzing overhead, he paused. Today was the best part of moving here, Maggie. Hands down. My heart did this stupid flip. I hadn't felt that in years. Summer hit hard after that. Dan started dropping by the library after school with 2 coffees, black for me, cream and sugar for him. We'd steal breaks in the back room, laughing over student stories or debating whether Lincoln was overrated. He brought me wildflowers from the roadside once, tucked them behind my ear like it was nothing. They reminded me of you, he said. Simple, strong, beautiful. Our first real date was the county fair in June. Lights everywhere, air thick with popcorn and diesel from the rides. The band played twangy covers, kids screamed on the tilt-a-whirl. Dan won me a giant stuffed bear at the shooting gallery, big goofy grin on his face when he handed it over. For lonely library nights, we shared funnel cake, sugar dusting our lips. On the Ferris wheel, high up where the world looked small and safe, he turned to me. Maggie, I'm falling for you. Fast, and I don't want to stop. I kissed him first that time. Soft, then deeper, the wheel turning slow circles while fireworks popped in the distance. My whole body hummed. For the first time, love didn't feel like a risk. It felt like coming home. The months blurred into magic. Picnics by the river with homemade lemonade and his arm around me. Drives in his beat-up Chevy to watch the sun melt over cornfields, windows down, radio low. He'd read me passages from history books at night, voice deep and steady, while I traced circles on his chest. Imagine living back then, he'd say. No cell phones, just letters and waiting. Waiting builds the best stories, I'd whisper back. He met my mom at 4th of July, charmed her with stories about frontier courage, helped grill burgers like he'd been family forever. Mom pulled me aside later. That man's got good hands and better eyes. He looks at you like you're the whole damn world. Christmas that year, he showed up with a silver locket, our initials engraved tiny on the front. Inside, a photo from the fair, us laughing with cotton candy stuck to my cheek. So you always have us close, he said, fastening it around my neck. I gave him a leather journal and a promise. Write our story in here someday. We married the following June. Small church, lilacs everywhere, vows that felt carved into my bones. I promise to love you honestly, completely, he said, voice thick. No secrets, just us. The honeymoon cabin in the dunes, long walks on sand, bonfires crackling, nights where we talked about kids we never had, a future wide open. This is it, Maggie, he murmured against my skin. You and me, forever. Back home we bought our house, porch swing, big garden, Scout the golden retriever who thought he owned the yard. Mornings, coffee and his sleepy grin. Evenings, dinner we cooked together, bumping hips, stealing kisses over the stove. We fought sometimes, silly stuff, like paint colors or late nights grading. But we'd always end up tangled on the couch, whispering sorries and I love yous till it faded. When Mom got sick, Dan drove me to every appointment, sat with me in waiting rooms, held me when the news wasn't good. We're in this, he'd say, all the way. Anniversaries came and went. Paris in '98, Chicago getaways, backyard vow renewals with string lights and friends. Each time, he'd look at me like day one. Still my favorite person, he'd say. Those years felt solid, real, the kind of love people write songs about. But now, knowing what I know, every tender moment twists. The locket I still wear, a reminder of promises half kept. The journal, blank pages where his other life should have been written. I loved him fiercely, blindly, and part of me still does. What if the beginning was the cruelest part? What if the bliss was just the setup for the fall? The story turns darker from here. The confession on his deathbed was only the beginning of unraveling everything. But before the shadows swallowed everything, there were 19 full years of light. 19 years that still feel like the truest thing I ever lived, even if they were built on ground that wasn't entirely mine. We didn't have a fairy tale mansion or endless money. We had a modest 2-story on Maple Street with creaky hardwood floors, a porch swing that groaned under our weight, and a backyard big enough for Scout to chase squirrels, and for me to plant every kind of flower I could name. That house became us. Every nail Dan hammered, every curtain I sewed, every laugh that echoed off those walls, it all felt permanent, sacred almost. Mornings were my favorite. I'd wake before the alarm most days, slip downstairs in my robe, while Dan was still snoring softly upstairs. Coffee first, black for me, 2 sugars, and a splash of cream for him. I'd set his mug on the counter, with a little note tucked underneath. Don't grade papers before 7 a.m., or I'll hide your red pen. He'd come down rumpled, hair sticking up, eyes still sleepy, and wrap his arms around me from behind while I stirred oatmeal. Morning, beautiful, he'd murmur into my neck. Every single time, like it was the first time, he'd noticed how good it felt to hold me. We ate breakfast at the small table by the window, sun spilling across the checkered cloth, Scout's tail thumping under our feet, begging for scraps. Dan would read bits of the newspaper out loud, funny headlines, weird local stories, while I pretended to be annoyed. You're ruining my quiet time, I'd say, but I was smiling so hard my cheeks hurt. Those little rituals anchored me, made the day feel safe before it even started. Weekends were for slow living. Saturday mornings, we'd drive to the farmer's market on the edge of town, baskets of tomatoes, still warm from the vine, jars of honey that tasted like summer, loaves of bread you could smell from the parking lot. Dan would bargain with the old Italian guy selling peppers just to make me laugh. Come on, Tony. She's got me on a budget, he'd say, winking at me. Tony would roll his eyes and knock $1 off anyway. We'd come home loaded down, spend the afternoon in the kitchen canning salsa or making pies, flour dusting our clothes, radio playing low in the background. Once, Dan smeared a streak of blueberry across my cheek and kissed it off. I chased him around the island with a wooden spoon until we both collapsed laughing on the floor, Scout licking our faces like we'd gone mad. What if I'd noticed how carefully he scheduled those weekends, how he was always home Friday night through Sunday evening, never once saying he had to run an errand out of town. Back then, it just felt like devotion. Now it feels like precision. We traveled when we could scrape the money together. Not fancy, never fancy, but meaningful. Our first big trip after the honeymoon was to the Smoky Mountains in '89. We rented a tiny cabin with no TV, just a wood stove and a porch overlooking misty ridges. Dan built fires every evening while I read aloud from whatever novel I'd packed. One night, the power went out during a thunderstorm. We sat in the dark, lightning flashing across his face, and he pulled me onto his lap under a quilt. This is better than any city, he said. Just you, me, and the rain. We made love by candlelight that night, slow and quiet, like the storm was the only thing in the world allowed to be loud. Paris came in '98, our big splurge for our 12th anniversary. We saved for 2 years, ate ramen some weeks so we could afford it, walking along the Seine at dusk, eating crepes from a street cart, kissing under the Eiffel Tower like teenagers. Dan bought me a tiny silver keychain shaped like a book. For all the stories we still have left to live, he said. I still have it on my key ring. Every time the keys jingle, I hear his voice. We never had children. The doctor said it was just one of those things, nothing wrong, nothing fixable. It hurt at first. God, it hurt. I cried in the shower some nights so Dan wouldn't hear. But he never made me feel broken. He'd pull me close and say, we've got each other. And Scout. And maybe someday we'll adopt a kid who needs a home as much as we need to give one. We talked about it seriously a few times, filled out paperwork once, but life kept shifting. His mom's cancer, my dad's heart issues, the library budget cuts. The dream quietly faded. And somehow that was okay. We poured all that extra love into each other, into Scout, into the kids Dan taught, into the garden that bloomed brighter every year. Anniversaries were always quiet and perfect. No big parties, just us. One year, he surprised me with a picnic at the old covered bridge where we used to go early on. Same blanket, same thermos of cider, same wildflowers he'd picked along the road. He read me the vows we'd written, word for word from memory. My throat closed up so tight I could barely speak. Still means every word, he said, kissing my knuckles. Every single one. What if those vows were only half true when he spoke them? What if no secrets was the one promise he knew he was already breaking? We fought, of course. Real fights. The kind where voices rise and doors slam. Once in '93, money was so tight we argued over whether to fix the leaking roof or replace the furnace. I wanted the roof. He said heat mattered more in Indiana winters. I stormed out, drove around for hours, came home to find him asleep on the couch with the estimate papers for the roof folded on his chest like a white flag. We fixed both eventually, piece by piece. But that night, we made up on the living room floor, whispering apologies between kisses, promising we'd never let money come between us again. Another time, maybe '97, he snapped at me over something small. I'd asked why he was so quiet after a conference trip to Louisville. He said, "Work stress, sharper than usual." I pushed. He shut down. We didn't speak for 2 days. On the third morning, I found a note on the coffee maker. "I'm sorry I took my fear out on you. You're the safest place I have. Forgive me." We cried in the kitchen, held each other so tight I could feel his heartbeat against mine. "I hate fighting with you," he said. "Makes me feel like I'm losing the best part of myself." Looking back, those silences weren't just stress. They were guilt wearing a mask. But at the time, they were just marriage. Messy, human, repairable. Through it all, Dan was my rock when the world shook. When my mother's Alzheimer's progressed and she stopped recognizing me, he drove me to the care home every Sunday, sat with us, held my hand while I cried in the parking lot afterward. "She's still in there," he'd say. "And even when she's not, you're still her daughter. That doesn't disappear." When his own father passed suddenly in one, I found him in the garage staring at an old fishing rod they used to use together. I didn't say anything, just sat beside him on the concrete until he was ready to talk. We buried his dad on a Tuesday. That night, he crawled into bed and let me hold him while he shook. We were each other's soft place to land. That part was never a lie. The garden became our shared obsession. Every spring, we'd spend weekends on our knees in the dirt, planting rows of zinnias, marigolds, sunflowers that grew taller than me. Dan would tease me about talking to the plants. "They like your voice better than mine," he'd say. I'd laugh and tell him they grew better when you loved them out loud. By August, the yard was a riot of color. Neighbors would stop by just to take pictures. One summer, a little girl from down the street asked if she could pick a flower for her mom. Dan knelt down, helped her choose the brightest zinnia, tied it with a piece of twine. "Tell her Mrs. Whittaker says hello," he said. The girl beamed. I watched him and thought, this man is good straight through. Scout grew old with us. Gray muzzle, slower steps, but still the same goofy grin. When he finally passed in year 2003, we buried him under the big maple in the backyard. Dan carved his name into a flat stone. We sat there until dark, my head on his shoulder, both of us quiet. "He was the best dog," Dan said, "and we gave him the best life." I nodded, throat too tight for words. That night, we held each other extra close, like we were reminding ourselves we still had time. 19 years, birthdays and Christmases, power outages and flu seasons, new curtains and old arguments, promotions and pay cuts, gray hairs and laugh lines. Through every season, Dan was there, steady, warm, mine. Or so I believed. What if the man who planted flowers with me every spring was watering a second garden somewhere else? What if the arms that held me through grief were holding another woman through hers on alternate weekends? What if the laughter that filled our kitchen echoed in another house too? Those questions burn now. But back then, back in the thick of those beautiful, ordinary years, there was no room for them. Only love. Deep, consuming, seemingly unbreakable love. And that's what makes the fall hurt the worst. Not that it was all fake, but that so much of it was achingly, heartbreakingly real. The cracks only started showing when the illness came, when time ran out, when he could no longer carry the weight of two lives. But that's for the next part. For now, just let the memory sit here with us. 19 years of mornings, gardens, picnics, apologies, and quiet nights on the porch swing. 19 years that shaped every soft corner of my heart, even if they were borrowed time. The cracks only started showing when the illness came, when time ran out, when he could no longer carry the weight of two lives. It didn't announce itself with fanfare. No dramatic collapse, no sudden hospital dash in the middle of the night. It whispered in at first small, easy to ignore things that I explained away because the alternative was too frightening to face. It began in the fall of 2004. Dan had always been the one with endless energy. He'd come home from school, grade a stack of essays, then still have enough left to mow the lawn or help me deadhead the zinnias before dinner. But that September, he started coming through the door looking smaller, shoulders rounded, steps slower. He'd drop his briefcase by the coat rack and sink into the recliner without even taking off his shoes. "Rough day?" I'd ask, setting a glass of iced tea on the side table. He'd nod, rub his temples. "Just tired, Maggie. The kids are full of fire this year." I believed him, teaching high school history to teenagers who'd rather scroll phones than listen to stories about Gettysburg. Yeah, that would wear anyone down. So I'd rub his shoulders, make his favorite chili, let him nap on the couch while I read beside him. Scout would curl up at his feet like a living heating pad. Normal, comforting, safe. But the tiredness didn't lift with the weekend. By October, he was coughing, a dry, persistent hack that started in the mornings and lingered through the day. I'd hear it from the kitchen while I brewed coffee, a sound like paper tearing inside his chest. He'd wave me off when I asked. "Allergies. Ragweed's bad this year. Indiana fall ragweed is brutal." So again, I let it slide. But the worry planted itself anyway, a tiny seed in the pit of my stomach that grew roots overnight. November brought the first real scare. We were at the hardware store, picking up paint for the guest bedroom, something cheerful, butter yellow, because the room felt too gray lately. Dan reached for a can on a high shelf, stretched, and then doubled over, coughing so hard his face turned red. People stared. He braced one hand on the shelf, the other on his knee, gasping between hacks. I rubbed his back in circles like you do for a child, whispering, "Easy, easy, breathe." When it passed, he straightened, wiped his mouth with the back of his hand, gave me that sheepish grin. "Sorry, must have inhaled some dust." I didn't smile back. "Dan, that's not normal." He looked away, picked up the paint can like nothing happened. "I'll see the doctor after the holidays. Promise, no sense ruining Thanksgiving over cough." I wanted to argue. God, I wanted to drag him to urgent care right then. But it was 2 days before Thanksgiving. My sister was flying in from Chicago. The house needed prepping, and part of me, the scared part, didn't want to hear bad news right before family filled the rooms with noise and laughter. So I nodded. After the holidays, you promised. He kept that promise in his own way. He saw the doctor in early December. A quick visit, chest x-ray, antibiotics for what the doc called a stubborn bronchial thing. Dan came home with a little brown bag of pills and a clean bill otherwise. See, just an infection. Nothing scary. The coughing eased a bit. The tiredness lingered, but he powered through. Christmas was beautiful that year, lights on the porch. Scout wearing a ridiculous red bow. Dan carving the turkey like always. We sat by the tree after everyone left, feet tangled under a blanket, and he pulled me close. Best one yet, he said softly. Love you more every year, Maggie. I rested my head on his chest, listened to his heartbeat, strong, steady, and told myself the worry was just me being overprotective, just wife stuff. January 2005 arrived cold and gray. The cough came back worse. Wet now, rattling. He'd disappear into the bathroom for long minutes, door closed, water running to mask the sound. I'd stand outside, ear to the wood, heart hammering. When he came out, his eyes were red-rimmed, face pale. Stomach bug, he'd mutter. Must have eaten something bad. I stopped believing the excuses around then. The seed of fear had sprouted thorns. February, he lost weight. Not dramatic at first, just enough that his belt needed a new hole. His cheeks looked sharper in photos. His shirts hung looser across the shoulders. I started cooking heavier meals, meatloaf, pot roast, anything to put calories back on him. He'd eat a few bites, push the plate away. Not hungry tonight, love. Sorry. One evening I found him asleep in the recliner at 7:30, head tipped back, mouth open, breathing shallow. Scout lay beside him, whining softly like he knew something was wrong. I knelt in front of Dan, touched his forehead, no fever. Just exhaustion so deep it looked like surrender. I covered him with the Afghan my mom made years ago and sat on the floor watching him sleep, tears sliding silent down my face. What if this was the beginning of losing him? What if the man who'd carried me through every storm was slipping away and I couldn't stop it? March. He started taking more sick days from school. The principal called me once, concerned. Dan says it's migraines, she told me. But he looks frail. Is everything okay at home? I lied, said yes, just a rough winter. Hung up and stared at the phone like it had betrayed me. The fear wasn't just worry anymore. It was a living thing, coiled tight around my ribs, squeezing every time he coughed, every time he winced reaching for something, every time his eyes drifted to the middle distance, like he was seeing something I couldn't. April, we finally got the real answer. Another doctor visit turned into a CT scan, then a pulmonologist, then words I still hear in nightmares. Mass in the right lung. Suspicious. Biopsy needed. Possible malignancy. The ride home from that appointment was silent, except for the hum of tires on wet pavement. Rain streaked the windows. Dan stared straight ahead, hands white-knuckled on the wheel. I reached over, covered his hand with mine. Whatever it is, I said, voice shaking, we face it together. Okay. He nodded once, didn't speak, but his thumb brushed over my knuckles, the smallest gesture, and it broke me open. I cried the rest of the way home, quiet so he wouldn't have to comfort me when he was the one breaking. The biopsy confirmed it 2 weeks later. Non-small cell lung cancer. Advanced. Stage 4. They found spots in the bones, the liver. The oncologist was kind, but blunt. Treatment could buy time, chemo, radiation, maybe targeted drugs, but cure wasn't on the table. We sat in the car outside the clinic for a long time after. Neither of us moved. Finally, Dan spoke, voice barely above a whisper. "I'm sorry, Maggie. I'm so damn sorry." I turned to him, tears streaming. "Don't you dare apologize for getting sick." He shook his head. "Not just that. For everything. For not taking better care. For not listening sooner. For making you carry this now." I cupped his face, made him look at me. "We carry it together. That's the deal. In sickness and in health, remember." He closed his eyes, leaned into my palm. I remember. The weeks after that blurred into hospital visits, infusion chairs, nausea that left him curled on the bathroom floor, nights when the pain woke him gasping, and I'd hold ice packs to his back until dawn. I learned how to flush his port, how to measure liquid morphine, how to pretend I wasn't terrified every time he closed his eyes for too long. Through it all, he tried to shield me, cracked weak jokes, bald looks good on me, right, and squeezed my hand when the nausea hit hardest. But there were moments when the mask slipped. He'd stare at the ceiling during quiet afternoons, tears leaking sideways into his pillow. When I asked what he was thinking, he'd say, "Just remembering the good days, the fair, the river, you." I'd climb onto the bed beside him, careful of the IV lines, and hold him until his breathing evened out. "We'll have more good days," I'd whisper. "We're not done yet." But deep down I knew we were running out of time. And in those final weeks, when the morphine made him drift and the room smelled like antiseptic and dying flowers, the whispers of worry turned into a roar inside me, not just about the cancer, about the silences I'd ignored, the trips to Louisville he never explained fully, the locked drawer I'd never forced open, the faraway look that came more often now, like he was saying goodbye to something or someone I didn't know about. What if the illness wasn't the only secret he'd been carrying? What if the man slipping away from me had been living two endings all along? I pushed the thought down, hard, because facing that on top of losing him would have shattered me completely. So I stayed in the moment, held his hand, kissed his forehead, told him every day how much I loved him, until the night he couldn't hold back anymore, until the confession that changed everything. But that moment is still ahead. For now, just sit with me in those long hospital afternoons, the beep of monitors, the slow drip of chemo, the way his fingers still found mine even when he was too weak to open his eyes. That was love too, even if it was shadowed. The final days unfolded in room 312 of St. Mary's Hospital in Lafayette, 3rd floor, oncology wing. The corridor always smelling faintly of bleach and wilting flowers. The room itself was small, clinical, beige walls, a single window overlooking a parking lot, and a strip of gray sky, a recliner that never quite got comfortable, and a bed that seemed to shrink Dan a little more each day. I moved in almost immediately after the oncologist said the word hospice. Not officially, no cot for family, but I brought a duffel with clothes, my toothbrush, the paperback I'd been reading for months without finishing, and the small framed photo from our first county fair. Us on the Ferris wheel, sugar on our lips, eyes bright with the kind of hope that only comes when you're still young enough to believe forever is a guarantee. The nurses knew better than to ask me to leave after visiting hours. They'd seen wives like me before. They'd just pull the door closed softly, dim the overhead light, and leave us in the glow of the bedside lamp and the blue pulse of the monitors. Dan spent most of his waking hours staring at the ceiling tiles or out the window. The morphine drip kept the worst of the pain at bay, but it also blurred the edges of him. His sentences drifted. His eyes would close mid-thought, then snap open like he'd remembered something urgent. I'd sit in the recliner, pulled close to the bed rail, holding his hand, thumb tracing the veins that stood out like blue rivers under thinning skin. "Maggie," he'd say sometimes, voice thin as paper, "tell me about the garden. Are the zinnias still blooming?" I'd lean in, describe every detail I could remember. The bright pinks and oranges pushing through the soil, the way the bees hovered like tiny helicopters, how I deadheaded them that morning even though my hands shook. I'd make it sound alive, vivid, like if I painted the picture bright enough he could step back into it for a minute. He'd smile, small, crooked, and squeeze my fingers. "You always made everything grow." Those words landed like stones in my chest. I wanted to ask, did you make something grow somewhere else too? Did you plant promises in another yard while I watered ours? But I swallowed them, swallowed everything, because the man in that bed wasn't hiding anymore, he was dying. And whatever secrets still lived between us would either come out or go with him. Forcing them now felt like cruelty. Nights were the longest. The hospital quieted after 10, only the occasional squeak of nurse shoes, the distant chime of an IV pump, the soft hiss of oxygen through his nasal cannula. I'd pull the recliner even closer, rest my head on the mattress, edge so my face was inches from his. Sometimes he'd wake suddenly, eyes wide and frightened. "It hurts," he'd whisper. I'd press the PCA button for an extra bolus, careful, always careful not to overdo it, and stroke his forehead until the lines eased. "I've got you," I'd say, "right here." Other nights he'd talk in fragments, memories spilling out like water from a cracked cup. "Remember the Smokies? That thunderstorm? You smelled like rain and pine. Remember Paris? The way the lights looked from the bridge. Remember when Scout ate half the Thanksgiving turkey and we laughed so hard we cried?" I'd nod, tears sliding into my hair. I remember every second. He never mentioned Kentucky, never mentioned her. But there were pauses, long, heavy ones, when his gaze would fix on the far wall like he was seeing another room, another bed, another hand holding his. I'd feel it like a cold draft, the presence of someone else in the space between us. I hated it. Hated the way jealousy could still rise up even now, petty and useless, against the tide of grief. One afternoon, a chaplain stopped by. Young guy, nervous, clutching a Bible like a shield. He asked if we wanted to pray. Dan shook his head slowly. "No thanks, son. I've said everything I need to say to whoever's listening." The chaplain looked at me. I shook my head too. After he left, Dan turned his face toward me. "I don't deserve forgiveness," he said quietly. My throat closed. "Don't talk like that." "I do. I know I do." I leaned over the rail, kissed his temple, dry, papery skin that smelled faintly of hospital soap. "You're my husband. That's enough." He closed his eyes. A tear slipped out, tracked down into his ear. "You were always enough, Maggie. always. Those words should have comforted me. Instead, they burned. Because if I was enough, why the other life? Why the silence? Why the division? But I didn't ask. Not yet. The asking would come later, when his breathing slowed to long, irregular pauses, and the nurse quietly turned off the extra monitors, when the room felt like it was holding its breath with us. The final week blurred into one long vigil. Friends came and went, my sister, Dan's colleagues, neighbors with casseroles nobody ate. They'd hug me, tell me he looked peaceful, tell me I was strong. I'd nod, smile thin, and count the minutes until they left so I could crawl back into the small circle of just us. Scout wasn't allowed in the hospital, but I brought his old collar once, leather worn soft, tag jingling faintly, and laid it on Dan's chest. He curled his fingers around it, smiled faintly. Good boy, he murmured. Best dog we ever had. I cried then, quiet, ugly sobs I muffled against the blanket. Dan lifted his free hand, trembling, and rested it on my head. Don't cry, love, not yet. But I couldn't stop. The night before the end, he was lucid for a little while, clearer than he'd been in days. The morphine had been dialed back because his breathing was already so shallow. He looked at me, really looked, and the old Dan flickered behind the sickness. Maggie, he said, voice stronger than it had any right to be. I need to tell you something, before I can't anymore. My heart slammed against my ribs. I knew, deep down, I'd always known something was coming. I nodded once. I'm listening. He took a long, rattling breath. There's another wife, Laura, in Kentucky. We married in 1982. I never divorced her. She knew about you right from the beginning. I told her everything when I fell in love with you. She said she loved me enough to let me have both. I thought I could keep it separate. Keep you happy. Keep her from hurting. I was wrong, so wrong. The room tilted. The beeping of the monitor seemed louder, sharper. My ears rang. 19 years. Every kiss, every promise, every I love you spoken, while another woman waited in another state. Fury rose hot, blinding, but grief drowned it almost instantly. Because the man confessing this wasn't some villain. He was my husband, the one who'd planted zinnias with me, held me through my mother's death, laughed with me on Ferris wheels, the one dying in front of me. Why? My voice cracked. Why didn't you choose? I tried. Tears leaked from the corners of his eyes. I couldn't. I loved you both. Different ways. Different pieces of me. I was a coward. I'm sorry, Maggie. I'm so damn sorry. He reached for my hand. I let him take it, because even now, even with the world cracking open, I couldn't pull away. I kept it from you, because losing you would have killed me sooner than this cancer ever could, he whispered. But I can't leave without you knowing. Forgive me, please, or at least, don't hate me. I couldn't speak. The words stuck somewhere between my heart and my throat. He squeezed my hand once more, weak, final. You were my home, Maggie, the real one. Then he closed his eyes. Breathing slowed. The pauses between inhales grew longer. I sat there holding his hand until the nurse came in, checked the monitors, looked at me with gentle eyes, and said softly, "He's gone." I didn't scream, didn't collapse. I just leaned over, kissed his forehead one last time, and whispered, "I heard you." The fury was there, burning low and deep, but so was the love. So was the grief. So was the unbearable ache of knowing he'd carried this secret to the grave, and only laid it down when he had no strength left to hold it. That night, alone in the room while they prepared his body, I stared at the empty bed and felt the weight of 19 years settle around me like fog. The truth was out, and somehow, impossibly, it didn't erase the love. It just changed its shape. Forever. Long silence. A single, shaky breath. I stayed in that room long after the nurse left. The monitors were silent now, no more beeping, no more rhythmic hiss of oxygen, just the low hum of the air conditioning and the faint metallic taste of grief in my mouth. They'd covered him with a clean sheet up to his shoulders, folded neatly like he was just sleeping. His face looked peaceful in a way it hadn't for months. Lines smoothed, jaw slack, the constant tension finally gone. I reached out and brushed a strand of thin gray hair off his forehead. My fingers lingered there, trembling. I didn't cry right away. The tears came later, in waves so violent I had to brace myself against the bed rail. But in that first stunned hour, I just sat, staring, replaying the last things he'd said, word by word, breath by breath. Maggie, I need to tell you something, before I can't anymore. His voice had been stronger than it should have been, almost desperate, like he'd been saving every scrap of energy for those next minutes. I'd felt the shift in the air the moment he spoke. The room had narrowed to just his face, the lamp's yellow glow catching the sweat on his upper lip, the way his eyes, still hazel, still the same eyes I'd fallen into 30 years earlier, locked on mine with sudden clarity. I'd nodded, I'm listening. He'd taken that long, painful inhale, the kind that rattled deep in his chest, and started. There's another wife, Laura, in Kentucky. We married in 1982. I never divorced her. The words landed like stones dropped into still water, ripples spreading outward, distorting everything. I remember my hand tightening on his, not pulling away, just gripping harder, as if holding on could stop the room from tilting. She knew about you, he continued, voice cracking on every syllable. Right from the beginning. When I met you, when I knew I loved you, I told her. I drove down there one weekend and sat on her porch and told her everything. I expected her to scream, to throw things, to tell me to get out and never come back. But she didn't. She just looked at me for a long time and said, if you love her the way you say you do, then go. But don't disappear on me completely. I can share you if it means I still have some part of you. His eyes filled, then tears pooling, spilling over, tracking down into the hollows of his cheeks. I thought I could keep it separate. 2 lives, 2 homes, 2 women who loved me enough to accept half a man. Weekdays and holidays with you in Elmwood. Weekends and summers with her in Kentucky. No kids with either of you, thank God, because how could I have done that to a child? I told myself it was fair, that nobody was getting hurt, that I was giving each of you what I could. He paused, breathing hard, the oxygen cannula slipping slightly. I reached up automatically to adjust it. My fingers shook so badly I almost couldn't. I was wrong, he whispered. So damn wrong. Every time I came home to you, every time I kissed you goodnight, every time I said, I love you, I felt the lie sitting right here. He pressed his free hand to his chest, right over his heart. It ate at me, but I was terrified. Terrified that if I chose, if I told you the truth, you'd walk away. And I couldn't lose you. You were my home, Maggie. The real one. The one where I breathed easiest. The fury hit me then sharp, blinding, like a slap I hadn't seen coming. My vision blurred with it. My throat burned. How could you? The words came out low, almost a growl. How could you stand in that church and promise no secrets? How could you look me in the eye every morning and build a life with me while another woman waited for you to come home on Fridays? He didn't flinch, just closed his eyes for a second, like the question physically hurt. Because I was a coward, he said simply. Because I loved you both, different ways, different pieces of my heart. I told myself it wasn't cheating if everyone knew, but it was. It was betrayal every single day. And I'm sorry. I'm so sorry I made you live in half a marriage. I wanted to scream, to shake him, to demand why he hadn't chosen me, why he hadn't chosen her, why he hadn't chosen honesty years ago when it might have spared us all this pain. But the man in front of me was dying. His skin was gray, his breathing shallow, his hand cold in mine. The rage had nowhere to go except inward, twisting around the grief until I couldn't tell one from the other. He opened his eyes again, looked at me like he was memorizing my face. I kept waiting for the right moment to tell you. After the cancer diagnosis, I thought maybe then. But I was scared it would kill you too. That you'd hate me, that you'd leave before I was gone. And I couldn't bear that. So I waited. Until now. Until there was nothing left to lose. A tear slipped down my cheek. Then another. I didn't wipe them away. Did you love her the same way? I asked, voice breaking. The way you loved me? He shook his head slowly. No, different. She was comfort, history. The girl I met when I was still figuring out who I was. You were everything else. Joy, home, the future I wanted but didn't deserve. I never lied when I said you were my everything. You were, you are. His voice cracked on the last word. He coughed weak, wet, and I helped him sip water through the straw, steadying the cup when his hand shook too much. I don't expect forgiveness, he said when he could speak again. I don't deserve it, but I needed you to know before I go, so you don't spend the rest of your life wondering why I looked away sometimes, why I took those trips, why I kept that drawer locked. It wasn't because I didn't love you. It was because I loved you too much to risk losing you. I sat there, holding his hand, feeling the pulse flutter under his skin, faint, irregular, fading. The fury was still there, burning low and steady. But so was the love. So was the ache of 19 years that had been real to me. The porch swing, the garden, the way he'd read to me at night, the way he'd held me when my mother forgot my name. Those things weren't lies. They couldn't be. I leaned over the rail, pressed my forehead to his. Our breaths mingled his shallow and labored, mine ragged with sobs I couldn't hold back anymore. I hate what you did, I whispered. I hate it so much it hurts to breathe. But I don't hate you. I can't. You're still the man I married, the man I built a life with, the man I'm losing right now. He exhaled a long, trembling sound. Thank you, he breathed, for saying that, for staying. I kissed his forehead, tasted salt and hospital skin. I'll always stay, I said, even now. His eyes drifted closed. The pauses between breaths grew longer. I kept talking soft, rambling about the zinnias, about Scout, about the Ferris wheel, about anything to fill the silence. Eventually, the pauses stretched into stillness. The nurse came in quietly, checked his pulse, looked at me with kind, tired eyes. He's gone, Mrs. Whittaker. I nodded, didn't move. She gave me a few more minutes alone. I stayed until the light outside the window turned the grayest shade of pre-dawn, until the room felt too empty to hold me anymore. When I finally stood, my legs shook. I leaned down one last time, kissed his lips, cool now, and whispered the last thing I'd ever say to him. I heard you, Dan. I heard every word. Then I walked out of that room carrying the heaviest thing I'd ever carried, the truth, and somehow, impossibly, the beginning of something like peace. Because he hadn't died holding the secret. He'd died giving it to me. Long, heavy silence. A single, slow exhale. The hospital corridor stretched endlessly in front of me, too bright, too quiet, too clean. My shoes squeaked on the linoleum with every step, a sound that seemed louder than the world should allow. I don't remember pushing the elevator button or riding down to the lobby. I just remember stepping outside into the pre-dawn air and feeling the cold slap me across the face, like it was trying to wake me up from a nightmare that wasn't ending. My car sat alone in the visitor lot, covered in a thin layer of frost. I unlocked it, slid behind the wheel, and sat there with the engine off, hands on the steering wheel, staring at nothing. Shock doesn't feel like a sudden explosion. It feels like the world has slowed down so much that every heartbeat echoes, like you're moving through water, like someone has turned the volume down on reality, and all you can hear is your own breathing, too loud, too fast. Long, heavy silence, a single, slow exhale. She knew about me. The words kept circling, crashing into each other like broken glass in my mind. I started the car. The heater blasted cold air at first, sharp, stinging. I didn't care. I drove home on autopilot, past dark fields and sleeping houses, past the turnoff to the river where we used to picnic. The radio was off. The only sound was the hum of tires and the occasional hitch in my breathing when a sob tried to break free. When I pulled into our driveway, the porch light was still on, left that way, because I'd told myself I'd be back soon. I sat in the car for a long time, engine running, headlights cutting through the dark yard. Scout's old collar still sat on the passenger seat where I'd left it. I picked it up, held it to my face, breathed in the faint smell of dog and worn leather. Then the dam broke. I cried like I hadn't cried since the night my mother died, ugly, wrenching sobs that hurt my ribs, that left me gasping. I cried for Dan, for the man who'd just left me, for the man who'd lied to me for 19 years, for the man who'd loved me enough to confess on his deathbed, for the man who'd loved someone else enough to keep her too. I cried until my throat was raw and my eyes burned, and there was nothing left but a hollow ache in my chest. When the crying finally slowed to shudders, I got out of the car. The cold bit into my skin. I walked up the porch steps, unlocked the front door, stepped inside. The house smelled like him, old books, coffee, the faint trace of his aftershave that still clung to the couch cushions. It smelled like home, and it smelled like a lie. I didn't turn on the lights. I just stood in the hallway, clutching Scout's collar, listening to the silence. That first night, those first hours, were a storm inside me. Shock and grief fought for space, but fury kept pushing its way to the front. I hated him. I hated him so much it felt like fire in my veins. How could he do this? How could he stand in our kitchen making pancakes on Sunday mornings, kiss me goodbye before work, hold me when I was scared, and all the while have another wife waiting? I walked into the living room, sank onto the couch, and stared at the framed photo on the mantel, Us at the county fair, arms around each other, laughing. I wanted to smash it. I wanted to take every picture of us down and burn them. Instead, I just sat there, tears dripping onto my lap, whispering over and over, "Why, Dan? Why?" Grief kept crashing in waves, pulling me under. I missed him already, the way he'd hum off-key while washing dishes, the way he'd leave little notes in my lunch bag even after all these years, the way he'd look at me across the room like I was still the most beautiful thing he'd ever seen. That man was gone, and the man who had replaced him in my mind, cold, calculating, deceitful, felt like a stranger. But he wasn't a stranger. He was Dan. My Dan. The guilt came next, sharp and unexpected. Had I missed signs? Had I been blind? Too trusting? Too comfortable? Had I made it easy for him to live two lives because I never asked hard questions? I remembered moments, small, fleeting ones, that suddenly looked different. The way he'd sometimes check his watch when we were out late on a Friday, saying he had an early meeting Saturday. The way he'd take calls in the garage, door closed. The locked drawer in his desk I'd always assumed held tax papers or old letters from his mother. I'd trusted him completely, and part of me hated myself for it now. But another part, the bigger part, hated that the trust had been weaponized against me. I got up sometime before dawn, walked to his desk in the corner of the living room. The drawer was still locked. I'd never had the combination. I stared at it like it might speak to me. What else was in there? Letters, photos, proof of another life. I didn't try to open it. Not yet. I wasn't ready. Instead, I went upstairs, crawled into our bed, his side still smelled like him, and pulled the covers over my head. I didn't sleep. I just lay there, replaying his last words on a loop. "She knew about you right from the beginning." Laura. The name felt foreign in my mouth, like a word from another language. Who was she? What did she look like? Did she love him the way I did? Did she hate me? Did she pity me? The questions piled up until my head ached. I couldn't stop them. They kept coming, faster and faster, until I felt like I was drowning in them. By morning, I was exhausted, bone deep, soul tired. My sister called. Friends texted. The funeral home left a message about arrangements. I let everything go to voicemail. I couldn't face the world yet, not while the world inside me was still breaking apart. That first week after he died was like living in a fog. I moved through the motions, showering, eating toast I didn't taste, watering the zinnias, because they'd die if I didn't. But I wasn't really there. I kept the house dark, kept the curtains closed, sat on the porch swing at night, wrapped in one of Dan's old flannel shirts, listening to crickets and trying to make sense of the hole in my chest. Shock gave way to a kind of numbness, then to bursts of emotion that hit without warning. I'd be folding laundry and suddenly remember his confession and have to sit down on the floor because my legs wouldn't hold me. I'd see his coffee mug in the sink and want to smash it. I'd smell coffee brewing and miss him so badly it felt like a punch. And always the questions. Who was Laura, really? Had she been to our house? Had she seen our garden, our bed? Did she know the stories he told me about his childhood, the ones he'd told her first? Did she know the way he took his coffee, the way he laughed at bad puns, the way he snored when he slept on his back? The thought of sharing him intimately, daily, made me sick. But the thought of him having no one else to share those things with felt almost worse. I hated that feeling most of all, the jealousy that still lived inside me even after death. I started writing things down, small scraps of paper I kept in a shoebox under the bed. Questions, memories, contradictions. When he said, "I love you" to me, did he mean it? When he renewed our vows in the backyard, was he lying? When he held me after Mom died, was that real? When he confessed at the end, was that the only honest moment? The answers wouldn't come. Not yet. But one thing became clearer every day. The man I'd loved had been real, and he'd been half a man at the same time. That truth hurt more than any single lie ever could. Because if half of him was mine, then half of me had been loving a ghost. And I didn't know how to mourn half a marriage. I didn't know how to forgive half a heart. But I knew I had to try. Because hating him forever would only poison what had been good. And there had been good. So much good. Long pause, a shaky breath, and hating him forever would only poison what had been good. So I knew I had to try to understand. Not forgive, not yet. Just understand. Because the questions wouldn't let me sleep. They followed me through every room of the house, sat beside me on the porch swing, stared back at me from the bathroom mirror when I brushed my teeth. Laura, who was she? How had she lived with this for almost as long as I had? And most of all, how had she known about me from the very beginning and still chosen to stay? The shoebox under the bed filled slowly. Scraps of paper, half-finished sentences, questions I couldn't answer alone. One morning, maybe 10 days after the funeral, when the casseroles had stopped arriving and the sympathy cards had piled up unopened on the hall table, I finally opened the locked drawer in Dan's desk. I didn't have the combination, never had, but grief makes you resourceful in strange ways. I found an old paperclip in the junk drawer, bent it straight, and after 20 minutes of fumbling and cursing under my breath, the lock clicked open. Inside, nothing dramatic at first. Old tax forms, a few report cards from his teaching years, a small stack of birthday cards I'd given him over the decades, tied with a faded rubber band. Then underneath, a thin manila envelope. No label, just my name in Dan's handwriting on the front. Maggie, if you're reading this, I'm sorry. My hands shook so badly, I almost dropped it. I carried the envelope to the kitchen table, sat down, and stared at it for a long time. The house was quiet, except for the tick of the wall clock and the faint creak of the porch swing moving in the breeze outside. Finally, I opened it, a single sheet of lined notebook paper folded in thirds. His handwriting neat, slanted slightly to the right, the same hand that had left me notes in my lunch bag for years. Maggie, if you found this, I'm gone and you know, or at least part of it. I kept this drawer locked not because I was hiding something evil, but because I was hiding my shame. There are letters in here, from her, from Laura. Read them if you want, or burn them. That's your choice. But know this, she never hated you. She never blamed you. She blamed me, and she was right too. There's also her phone number, if you ever want to talk to her. I told her years ago that if anything happened to me, you might reach out. She said she'd answer. No anger, no games, just truth. I love you. I always did, even when I didn't deserve to. Dan and I sat there for what felt like hours, the paper trembling in my fingers. Then I reached back into the drawer, a small bundle of envelopes, maybe 15 or 20. postmarked from a town in Kentucky I'd never heard of. Dates spanning from 1987 to 2004. The most recent one was from 2 years earlier. I didn't read them all. Not that day. I couldn't. But I opened one from 1995 midway through our marriage. The handwriting was neat, feminine, careful. Dan, I got your letter about the Paris trip. I'm glad you went. Glad she got to see the Eiffel Tower with you. I know how much she means to you. I see it in the way you write about her, different from how you write about me. Not less, just brighter. I'm not angry. Not anymore. I was, at first, when you told me you'd met someone and couldn't choose. I cried for weeks. But then I realized something. If I forced you to pick, I'd lose you completely. And losing you completely would hurt worse than sharing you. So I stay. I keep my little house, my garden, my quiet life. And when you come down every other weekend, I pretend it's enough. Tell Maggie I said hello. I mean that. She sounds like a good woman. She deserves to be happy, even if it's with half of you. Take care of yourself. And her, Laura, I read it twice, 3 times. No venom, no bitterness, just quiet acceptance laced with sorrow. I opened another one from 2001 after Dan's father died. Dan, I'm sorry about your dad. I know how much you loved him. I lit a candle for him at the little church down the road. I hope that's okay. I think about Maggie sometimes. How she must have held you when you cried. I'm glad you had her then. I couldn't be there. Not the way she could. You're still my husband on paper, but she's your wife in every way that matters. I know that. I've known it for a long time. Come home when you can. The porch light's on. Laura, tears fell onto the paper, smudging the ink. I didn't feel rage reading those letters. I felt seen by a woman I'd never met. A woman who'd lived in the shadow of my life the same way I'd unknowingly lived in hers. She hadn't been the villain. She'd been another person trying to hold onto love the only way she knew how. And Dan, he'd been the bridge between us. Flawed, cowardly, but not cruel. I sat at that kitchen table until the light changed from morning to afternoon. Letters spread out in front of me like pieces of a puzzle I hadn't wanted to solve. The revelation wasn't that he'd had another wife. The revelation was that she'd known me through his stories, through his guilt, through the way he spoke about me, and she'd never tried to take him away. She'd let him go to me every Monday morning. She'd accepted half a marriage so he could have a whole one with someone else. That kind of love, or maybe that kind of resignation, hurt to think about. But it also softened something inside me. The fury didn't disappear. It just quieted, made room for sorrow, for her sorrow, for mine, for his. I folded the letters carefully, put them back in the envelope, tucked Dan's note on top. Then I picked up the phone. Her number was written on the back of his note. Same handwriting, same slanted letters. I dialed before I could talk myself out of it. It rang 4 times. I almost hung up. Then a soft voice answered. Hello? I swallowed. My mouth was dry. Laura, this is Maggie Whittaker, Dan's wife, from Indiana. A long pause. Not hostile, just breathing. I've been waiting for this call, she said quietly. I'm so sorry for your loss, Maggie. The kindness in her voice undid me. I started crying again, quiet this time, almost gentle. I read some of your letters, I managed. He kept them. In a drawer. Another pause. I figured he might, she said. He was always sentimental that way. I wiped my eyes with the back of my hand. I don't know what to say, I admitted. I'm angry. I'm hurt. But I'm also, I don't know, sad for you too. She let out a small, shaky laugh, not mocking, just tired. Sad is the right word, she said. We've both been sad a long time, haven't we? We talked for almost 2 hours that first call. No yelling, no accusations. Just two women who'd loved the same man, sharing the pieces he'd left behind. She told me about their early years, young, impulsive courthouse wedding, dreams of a farm, how life pulled them in different directions when he took the teaching job up north. She told me how he'd come to her one weekend in '86, sat on her porch steps, and said he'd met someone. How he'd cried when he told her he couldn't choose. How she'd cried too, but how she'd said yes anyway, yes to sharing, because losing him entirely felt worse. She asked about me, about our house, our garden, Scout, the trips to Paris. She listened like she already knew the stories, but wanted to hear them from the person who'd lived them. I pictured you sometimes, she said softly, when he'd talk about you. I pictured a woman who made him laugh, who made him better. I was glad he had that, even if it wasn't with me. I told her about the zinnias, about how he'd always read to me at night, about how he'd held me when my mother forgot who I was. She listened, really listened. When we finally hung up, the sun was setting. The kitchen was gold with late light. I didn't feel healed, not even close, but I felt less alone, because the other woman wasn't an enemy. She was another heart that had been broken in the same way mine had. And that gentle revelation, that shared sorrow, was the first crack of light in all the darkness. Long, quiet pause, a soft exhale. We talked on the phone a few more times over the next couple of weeks. Short calls at first, 10 minutes, 15 testing the waters, then longer, an hour, 2. We spoke about safe things at the start, the weather in Kentucky versus Indiana, how the leaves were turning earlier down there this year, how her garden had tomatoes that wouldn't quit even in October. Safe things, things that didn't touch the wound. But eventually the conversation always circled back to him, to Dan, and when it did, neither of us pulled away. One evening she said, quiet, almost hesitant, I think we should meet, in person, if you're ready. My stomach flipped, part fear, part curiosity, part something I couldn't name. I waited 3 days before calling her back. Okay, I said, let's do it. We chose neutral ground, a small cafe halfway between Elmwood and her town in Kentucky, about a 3-hour drive for each of us. Public, quiet, somewhere we could leave if it became too much. I drove down on a Saturday in early November. The sky was low and gray, the kind of day that makes everything feel closer to the ground. I wore the silver locket Dan had given me for our first Christmas, our initials still engraved inside, the tiny fair photo still tucked behind the glass. I told myself it was for courage. Maybe it was. The cafe was called River Bend Diner, old brick building, checkered floors, booths with cracked vinyl seats. I arrived early, chose a corner table by the window, ordered black coffee. I didn't drink. My hands shook so badly the cup rattled against the saucer. She walked in at exactly the agreed time, smaller than I'd pictured. Silver hair pulled back in a loose bun, navy cardigan over a pale blue blouse, eyes the same hazel as Dan's in the old photos I'd seen. She carried a canvas tote bag like she might need something to hold on to. Our eyes met across the room. She paused just a second, then walked over. "Maggie," she said softly. "Laura." We didn't hug right away. We just stood there, two strangers who knew the same man better than anyone else ever would. Then she sat down across from me. The waitress came over. Laura ordered tea chamomile. I asked for a refill. I still wouldn't drink. Silence settled between us. Not awkward exactly. More like the silence before a storm breaks and everything gets clean. She spoke first. "I've rehearsed this 100 times," she said. "What I'd say if we ever met. And now I'm here, and the words feel too small." I nodded. "Me too." She looked down at her hands, plain gold wedding band, still on her left ring finger. She twisted it slowly. "I never wanted to hurt you," she said. "That's the first thing I need you to know." I told myself that every time he left on Sunday nights, that you were happy, that he was happy with you, that it wasn't my place to break that. I swallowed hard. "Did it ever feel like enough?" I asked. "The half he gave you?" She looked up, eyes shining. "No," she said simply. "It never did, but it was better than nothing. And I loved him enough to take the scraps." The words landed soft but heavy. I reached into my purse, pulled out one of her letters, the one from 1995, and laid it on the table between us. "I read this one," I said. "You told him to tell me hello. You said I sounded like a good woman." Her fingers brushed the paper. "I meant it," she whispered. "I could hear it in the way he talked about you, the way his voice changed. Lighter, like he could breathe when he was with you." Tears pricked my eyes. "He talked about you too," I said. "Not often, but when he did, it was always with this quiet guilt, like he knew he was stealing something from both of us." She nodded slowly. "We were both stealing," she said. "I stole weekends. You stole weekdays and holidays and the everyday life. And he stole time from both of us by not choosing." We sat with that for a minute. The waitress refilled my coffee without asking. Neither of us touched it. I took a breath. "Tell me about your life with him," I said, "the parts I didn't know." She hesitated, then began. They'd met in Louisville in 1981. She was 27, working as a librarian in a small branch ironic. She said, with a small smile. He was 29, fresh out of grad school, teaching night classes while he looked for a full-time position. They met at a bookstore reading. He bought her coffee after. 3 months later, they were married at the courthouse. No big wedding, just them and 2 witnesses from the diner next door. They rented a little house with a porch and a yard, planted tomatoes, talked about kids someday. Then the teaching job in Indiana came up, better pay, better benefits. He moved first, promised to come back every weekend. At first he did. Then he met me. She paused, sipped her tea. "When he told me," she said, "he cried the whole way through. Said he'd never meant to fall in love again. Said he didn't know how to stop it. I asked him to choose. He said he couldn't, that he loved us both. Different, but real." She looked at me then, really looked. "I hated you for a while," she admitted. "Not because you did anything wrong, because you had the life I wanted. The mornings, the porch swing, the garden, the way he looked at you when he talked about you. I could hear it over the phone. I wanted that look." I felt my throat tighten. "I never knew," I said. "I swear I never knew." "I know," she said gently. "That's what made it bearable. You weren't stealing him on purpose. You were just living the life he built with you." We talked for hours. She told me about their quiet weekends, drives to the lake, dinners on the porch, how he'd read history books aloud to her the same way he read to me, how he'd bring her zinnias, sometimes, starts from our garden, and she'd plant them anyway. I told her about our life, the fair, Paris, Scout, the way he'd dance with me in the kitchen when no one was watching. We laughed once, soft, surprised, when we both said at the same moment, "He always burned the toast." Then we cried, together, not dramatic sobs, just quiet tears, shared. At one point, she reached across the table and covered my hand with hers. Her skin was cool, soft, familiar in a way that made no sense. "I'm sorry," she said, "for all of it." "I'm sorry too," I whispered, "for the years you waited." She shook her head. "We both waited," she said, "in different ways." When the waitress started giving us polite, "We're closing soon" looks, we paid the bill, split it, no argument, and walked outside. The air was crisp, the parking lot empty except for our 2 cars. We stood there under the neon sign, breath fogging between us. "I don't know what happens next," I said. "Neither do I," she answered. "But I'd like to keep talking." "If you would," I nodded. "I would." We hugged, then awkward at first, then real. 2 women who'd never met, but had shared the same heartbeat for decades. She got in her car. I got in mine. I watched her taillights disappear down the highway. Then I drove home. The house felt different when I walked in. Not less empty, just less hostile. I sat on the porch swing that night, wrapped in Dan's flannel, and looked at the stars. For the first time since his death, the weight on my chest felt a little lighter. Not gone, but shared. And that sharing, that quiet, compassionate meeting, was the beginning of something I hadn't expected. Healing. Slow, painful, but real. Long, gentle pause. A soft breath. After that day at the River Bend Diner, the questions didn't stop. They just changed shape. They stopped being sharp weapons aimed at Dan and started feeling more like tired old friends, ones I could sit with on the porch swing at dusk without wanting to scream. Why had he done it? Why hadn't he chosen? Why had he let the lie grow for 19 years instead of cutting it out like a bad root? I asked myself those questions every day, sometimes out loud, sometimes in the silence of the empty house. I asked them while watering the zinnias that still bloomed stubbornly in November. I asked them while folding his old flannel shirts I couldn't bring myself to give away. I asked them while staring at the wedding photo on the mantel, us smiling in front of the church, lilacs in my hair, his arm around my waist like it belonged there forever. The answers didn't come all at once. They came in fragments, in memories that suddenly looked different, in conversations with Laura that stretched late into the night over the phone, in the letters. I finally read all of them, this time sitting at the kitchen table with a pot of chamomile tea neither of us had ever liked, but both of us kept drinking anyway. The first piece clicked into place one rainy afternoon when I reread the note he'd left in the drawer. I was terrified that if I chose, if I told you the truth, you'd walk away. And I couldn't lose you. You were my home, Maggie, the real one. Terror, that word kept coming back. Dan had always seemed so steady. The rock, the one who held me when the world shook. But underneath that calm surface had been a man terrified of being alone, of being rejected, of having to live with the consequences of his own choices. I remembered small moments now that made more sense in hindsight. The way he'd sometimes freeze when I asked about his weekends back home in Kentucky before he moved the story to vague family visits. The way he'd change the subject when I suggested we drive down to see his mother together. The way he'd come home Sunday nights looking hollow-eyed, like he'd left part of himself somewhere else. He hadn't wanted to lose either of us, so he kept us both, and the keeping cost him. I could see it now in the way his smiles sometimes faltered in photos from the last few years, in the way he'd stare off during quiet evenings on the porch swing, like he was carrying a weight I couldn't see, in the way he'd apologize for nothing, little things, like being 5 minutes late from the grocery store, like he was always trying to make up for something bigger. Fear had been the glue holding the two lives together. Fear of hurting Laura by choosing me. Fear of losing me by choosing her. Fear of facing himself if he finally picked one truth over the other. Laura helped me see that part most clearly. During one late night call, she said, soft, almost like she was confessing something herself. He was always afraid of endings, even as a boy. His dad used to tell stories about how Dan would cry for days when the family dog got old and had to be put down, not because he loved the dog more than anything, though he did, but because he couldn't stand the finality, the door closing, the thing being gone forever. She paused. I think that's why he couldn't end one marriage to start another. He couldn't bear the door closing on either of us. So he left both doors cracked, and we both walked through them, thinking we were the only ones. Hearing her say it didn't make the hurt disappear, but it made it human. Dan hadn't been a monster. He'd been a man who loved too widely and too weakly at the same time, who wanted everything without knowing how to hold it, without breaking it. He'd kept the truth hidden because the truth would have forced a choice, and choice meant loss, and loss, at least in his mind, meant emptiness. So he lived in the middle, 2 homes, 2 beds, 2 women who loved him, and one heart divided until it couldn't beat anymore. The guilt he carried must have been crushing. I could see it in the letters now, the way he wrote to Laura about me, always with this mixture of joy and shame. The way he wrote to me about his family trips with careful vagueness. He wasn't proud of the lie. He was trapped by it. And in the end, when the cancer made the trap unbearable, when time ran out, and there were no more weekends to split, he chose truth. Not because he was brave, but because he was out of places to hide. That final confession wasn't an act of cruelty. It was an act of desperation. One last chance to be seen fully, ugly parts, and all by the woman he'd called home. I sat with that realization for weeks. Some days it made me angry all over again. How dare he put that burden on me at the very end? How dare he wait until he was dying to give me the truth? Other days, it made me sad in a way that hurt deeper than anger ever could. Sad for the young man who'd married Laura too fast. Sad for the middle-aged man who'd met me and couldn't let go. Sad for the dying man who'd finally run out of lies and had nothing left but honesty. Sad for Laura, who'd waited in the quiet house with the porch light always on. Sad for me, who'd built a beautiful life on ground that wasn't entirely solid, but mostly sad for Dan, because in trying to keep everything, he'd ended up losing the chance to have anything whole. What if he'd chosen one path early? What if he'd told me the truth in year 2 instead of year 19? What if he'd been brave enough to close one door? We'll never know. And maybe that's the hardest part. The what ifs don't have answers, they just echo. But understanding his reasons, fear, cowardice, a desperate hunger to be loved without limits, didn't erase the pain. It just gave it shape, a shape I could finally look at without wanting to turn away. I started sleeping better after that. Not great, not peaceful, but better. I stopped staring at the locked drawer like it was a bomb. I stopped flinching when I heard his name in old voicemails. I started wearing the locket again, not as a chain, but as a reminder that love, even broken love, leaves marks that don't vanish. And I started talking to Laura more openly. Not every day, but enough. We sent photos sometimes, her garden, my zinnias. We laughed about how he'd always burned the toast. We cried about how much we'd both missed him in different rooms of the same life. We weren't friends exactly. Not yet. But we weren't strangers anymore. We were two women who'd loved the same impossible man. And in that shared understanding, something began to loosen inside me. The fury didn't disappear, but it stopped being the loudest voice in the room. In its place came a quieter sorrow, a sorrow that felt less like punishment and more like mourning. Mourning the man he could have been. Mourning the marriage we could have had if he'd been brave. Mourning the years Laura lost waiting. Mourning the piece of myself I'd given to a half-truth. And in that mourning, there was finally room for something else. Room for forgiveness. Not today, not tomorrow, but someday. Because understanding why he did it didn't make it right, but it made it human. And I'd loved him when he was human. I could still love the memory of him now, even knowing everything. Long, reflective pause. A slow, steadying breath. Forgiveness didn't arrive like a thunderclap. It didn't come with trumpets or a sudden rush of peace that erased the hurt. It came slow, inch by inch, day by quiet day, like the way spring creeps back into Indiana after a long winter. First, a few crocuses pushing through frozen ground, then the forsythia bursting yellow, then finally the whole yard breathing again. It started with small things. I stopped flinching when I passed the wedding photo on the mantel. One morning, I even dusted the frame instead of turning it face down like I'd done for weeks after the funeral. I looked at our smiles, younger, brighter, and whispered to the empty room, "You were real to me." That part was real. I kept wearing the locket. Not every day, but often enough that the silver warmed against my skin and stopped feeling like a chain. I planted new zinnias the next spring, bright pinks and oranges, the same colors Dan used to pick for me from the roadside. When they bloomed, I cut a bunch, put them in the blue vase on the kitchen table, and said out loud, "These are for you, and for me, because we both loved them." Laura and I kept talking. Not every week anymore. Life was starting to move again. But every few weeks, a call would come, or an email with a photo of her porch swing, or my garden, or the river. We both knew in different ways. We never said sister or friend out loud. We didn't need to. The word that fit was quieter. Survivor. Two women who'd survived the same impossible love. One afternoon, she sent me a picture of a small wooden bench she'd placed under an oak tree in her yard. She'd carved Dan's initials into the backrest. Simple, neat, the way he used to carve Scout's name on the stone in our backyard. "I sit there sometimes," she wrote, "not to mourn him, just to remember the good parts. I thought you should know." I cried when I read that. Not the wrenching sobs from the early days, softer tears, the kind that leave you lighter afterward. I wrote back. I sit on our porch, swing the same way. Maybe we're both keeping him company in different places. She replied the next day. Maybe he's finally at peace knowing we're not hating each other. That sentence stayed with me. Dan's final honesty hadn't been perfect. It hadn't undone the years of deception. But it had been the one moment he chose not to hide anymore. He'd looked at me dying, scared, exhausted, and said the truth anyway. Even knowing it might be the last thing I remembered about him, he could have slipped away silent, left me with beautiful memories and a question mark I'd never resolve. Instead, he gave me the hard truth, and in giving it, he gave me the chance to decide what to do with it. I decided slowly, painfully, to let the bitterness go. Not because he deserved it, but because I deserved it. I deserved mornings without rage waking me up. I deserved to walk through my garden without wondering which flowers he'd planted thinking of someone else. I deserved to remember the Ferris wheel and the Paris lights and the way he'd read poetry to me without a shadow falling over every memory. Forgiving him meant choosing to keep the light parts. It meant saying, yes, you hurt me, deeply, irreparably in some ways, but you also loved me, truly, fiercely, in the ways you knew how. And I won't let the lie steal the love that was real. So one evening in late spring, almost a year after he died, I sat on the porch swing with a cup of chamomile tea and the locket open in my palm. The tiny photo of us at the fair stared back, sugar on our lips, eyes full of forever. I spoke to him not out loud, but in the quiet space inside my chest where his voice still lived. I forgive you, Dan, not because it was okay, but because holding onto the hate is heavier than I want to carry for the rest of my life. You told me the truth when you had nothing left to lose. That took courage. The courage you didn't have when you were whole, but you found it at the end, and I'm grateful for that. I closed the locket. Click. Then I added, softer, I loved you. Half a man or whole, I loved you. And I'm letting the pain go so I can keep loving the memory of you without it hurting so much. The breeze moved the swing gently. Crickets started their evening song. Scout's old stone under the maple tree caught the last of the sun. I felt something loosen inside me, something that had been knotted tight since that hospital room. Not gone, but lighter. I started living again after that. Small steps. I went back to the library part-time, volunteering, recommending books to kids who reminded me of the ones Dan used to teach. I joined a gardening club, made friends who didn't know the whole story and didn't need to. I traveled once alone to the Smoky Mountains cabin where we'd spent that stormy weekend. Sat on the porch during a rain, listened to the thunder, and smiled instead of crying. Laura and I met again, twice more over the next year. Once at her place in Kentucky, once at mine in Elmwood. We walked our separate gardens, shared coffee, talked about him without flinching, laughed at his terrible jokes, cried when we needed to. We never called each other family, but we treated each other like it. And in that quiet way, we both found a kind of closure. Not the kind that ties everything up in a bow, the kind that lets you breathe again. I still miss him every day. I still wear the locket sometimes. I still sit on the porch swing and watch the sun set over the cornfields. But the missing doesn't cut the same anymore. It's softer now, warmer, like remembering a song you used to dance to instead of remembering the one who stepped on your feet. He gave me the truth at the end, and I gave myself permission to keep the love, to let go of the pain, to move forward, not forgetting, but not chained either. That's the peace I found. Not perfect, but mine. Long, gentle pause, a soft, steady breath. And so here I am, 2 years on from that hospital room, 2 years from the confession that broke my heart and then slowly mended it. The house on Maple Street still creaks the same way. The porch swing still sways in the evening breeze. The zinnias still bloom every summer, brighter than ever, like they're trying to remind me life keeps going. I still talk to Dan sometimes, quiet words to the empty chair beside me, or to the stone under the maple where Scout rests. I don't expect answers. I just like knowing the sound of my voice fills the spaces he used to fill. I honor his memory now by keeping what was good and letting the rest go. I keep the photos on the mantle, not hidden, not turned away. I smile at the young couple on the Ferris wheel, sugar on our lips, eyes full of dreams we didn't yet know would bend. I keep the locket in the drawer most days, but I wear it on quiet evenings when I need to feel close to the man who loved me fiercely, even if he couldn't love me fully. I keep the garden thriving. Every spring I plant extra rows, because Dan taught me how to make things grow even when the ground feels hard. And every bloom feels like a small thank you for the years of laughter, for the way he held me through loss, for the final gift of truth he gave when he had nothing else left to give. Laura and I still talk. Not often. Life has its own rhythm now, but enough. We send postcards sometimes. A photo of her porch bench with his initials, a snapshot of my zinnias against the Indiana sky. We don't talk about the pain much anymore. We talk about the good parts, the way he laughed, the way he burned toast, the way he made each of us feel seen, even if only for half the time. We've become something like friends, two women who once shared a man, now sharing a quiet understanding that love can be complicated and still worth remembering. Acceptance came easier than I thought it would. He told me the truth before he left forever. That was his last act of courage. He could have slipped away silent, leaving me with beautiful lies. Instead, he chose honesty, even when it hurt us both. And in that choice, he gave me the gift of knowing, the gift of deciding what to do with the truth. I decided to accept it, not because it was okay, but because holding onto the what-ifs and the whys was heavier than I wanted to carry into whatever years I have left. So I let go, not of the love, never of the love, but of the pain that clung to it. I let go of the fury that woke me in the night. I let go of the questions that used to circle like vultures. I let go of the need to hate him in order to feel whole. In its place came something softer. Joy. Not loud, fireworks joy. Quiet joy. The kind that sneaks up on you when you're watering flowers at dawn and realize you're smiling for no reason. The kind that warms you when you sit on the porch swing at sunset and feel the breeze instead of the absence. I travel now small trips. A weekend in the Smokies. A week in Chicago. I walk places we used to walk, but I walk them alone, and the memories don't sting anymore. They just feel like old songs, sweet, familiar, part of who I am. I've started writing again. Little stories, nothing grand, just pieces about gardens and porches, and the way love can bend without breaking. Maybe one day I'll finish that journal he gave me. Maybe I'll write our story, not the hidden parts, but the real ones, the ones that mattered. Life isn't perfect. It never was, but it's mine, and I'm living it. With zinnias in the yard, with a porch swing that still creaks, with a heart that learned to forgive, with a memory of a man who wasn't whole, but who loved me as best he could, and with the quiet joy of knowing I'm okay, more than okay. I'm free. Thank you for walking this road with me. Comment down below. What do you think? What should have I done different? And don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe for more. If you are interested in watching Why My Son Trapped Us for Money, click here.